The story begins with someone walking down a path in the woods that leads to a cabin. In the basement of the cabin is a princess that the person is tasked with slaying. They are told that if they do not slay the princess, it will be the end of the world as we know it. No more birds, trees, or people. The speaker implores the person to complete this important task and not linger on the specifics, saying they have made it this far already, so they might as well reach the end of their journey. The speaker assures the princess is locked up because she is dangerous, not the other way around. They state that causality does not matter here since the end result is the same either way. If the princess leaves the cabin, the world will end. There is no use arguing semantics when the egg has hatched and is about to ruin everything unless the person does their job and slays her. The speaker says they do not make the rules, they just have to follow them. When questioned further, the speaker tempts the person with a special reward if they slay the princess first. They say it will be even better than the person's wildest imagination. The speaker affirms they have not considered just letting the princess go, as nobody wants the world to end except for maybe nihilists or very evil people. The person decides to hear the princess out before slaying her. The speaker warns that this is a mistake. The princess could trap the person in her web of lies, making it harder for them to fulfill their duty. But the person proceeds down the stairs to the basement anyway. The basement is described as oppressive, with stale, damp air and hints of rot. A voice calls up asking who is there. The speaker says this princess sounds dangerous and it's likely part of her manipulation. The person proceeds down the stairs and locks eyes with the princess, who is chained to the wall. She asks if the person is there to kill her, noting the knife they carry. The person explains the speaker told them to come slay her to save the world. The princess questions how she could possibly end the entire world and has been locked in this basement so long she barely remembers what the world is like. The speaker interjects that she does not need to know how to destroy the world to be capable of doing it. But the person drops their knife against the speaker's warnings to talk with the princess unarmed. The princess acknowledges the awkward start to their meeting. She reiterates she does not want to hurt anyone or end the world and has just been chained in this basement. The person believes her story. The princess says this situation comes down to trust. Can the person trust her or the unknown speaker who put her here? The speaker argues it is about risk, not trust. The princess poses too great a risk to the entire world. When asked, the princess says she has been called Your Royal Highness and other honorifics. The speaker takes this as proof she cannot be trusted. But the person offers to find the key and free the princess from her chains. The princess suggests using the knife to cut her free. After more discussion, the person attempts to run the princess through with the knife, but hesitation allows the princess to evade the attack and deliver a crushing blow to the person's jaw. A brutal fight ensues where they seem evenly matched, both sustaining heavy injuries. The speaker urges the person to keep fighting, saying they can still win. The two clash one final time, each delivering fatal blows, the person's blade into the princess's heart, the princess's fist into the person's body. Both fall to the floor, fatally wounded. As the person fades into death, the princess calls this fun and questions if they really think this is the end. Begins again back at the start, with the person walking down the forest path that leads to the cabin and princess. The speaker has no memory of what transpired before. When the person explains they already did this and died, the speaker insists this is the first time. If the person did die last time, it is because they did not listen to the speaker's instructions. The speaker suggests there may have been consequences to the person's actions last time, though the person argues there were none since everything reset back to the beginning. The speaker counters that this begs the question of how the person returned here. Did time rewind, or were they transported to a different world? And what happened to the first world they left behind? The speaker implores the person to listen this time for success. But the person persists in asking questions, wanting the full picture. The speaker maintains the less they know, the better. When the person asks why they've been chosen for this task, the speaker says it's because they are special and prophesied. The person suggests they do not have to fight the princess. They could just walk away. The speaker mocks this idea, saying the path will only lead back to the cabin. But when the person ignores their warnings and leaves anyway, the speaker loses their composure and demands to know where they are going. The person finds themselves in an unfamiliar setting, no longer on a path or near the cabin. The speaker panics, exclaiming they were not supposed to be able to leave. The transcript ends abruptly there. The story begins with someone walking down a path in the woods, seemingly on their way to confront someone referred to as her. They steel themselves and enter a cabin, finding a table with a blade on it. The blade seems important, like a weapon that will be needed. The door to the basement opens and a voice taunts the protagonist, questioning if they really think they can kill whoever is down there. The voice warns not to come downstairs, but the protagonist is determined, gripping the blade tightly. The protagonist heads down the stairs to the basement, noticing the warped, broken wood and a metallic scent like blood in the air. Scraping sounds can be heard from below. At the bottom of the damaged stairs is a figure chained up, who pleads to be set free. The chained figure continues trying to manipulate the protagonist, asking again to be released and claiming to be an innocent princess. The protagonist doesn't believe her claims and thinks it's an act to get them to come closer. The two go back and forth, the chained woman making vaguely threatening statements, while also insisting she's no danger. Ultimately, the protagonist charges, blade in hand, but the figure reveals a hidden blade of her own, slashing the protagonist's neck. As they bleed out, the protagonist manages to stab her in the heart. Both collapse, rapidly bleeding to death. The figure questions how she thought it would go differently, but claims they can't die. The protagonist fades into death. The loop starts over, with the protagonist back on the path, being warned not to trust the figure they'll confront, who will deceive them. Entering the cabin again, the only item of note is the blade on the table. Heading to the basement, the protagonist finds the chained woman again, who repeats her pleas and manipulations. The two debate if they've done this before, the protagonist sure while the woman denies it. After more fruitless back and forth, the protagonist charges again, but the figure again reveals a hidden blade, severing their hand before killing them. The loop starts over a third time, now with the protagonist skipping the woods and finding themselves already in the cabin. The basement door leads to a slide down to the basement. The chained woman acknowledges their repeated failures to kill her. When the protagonist hesitates, she attacks, cutting off her own chained arms before advancing. The protagonist tries flirting in desperation, which briefly works before she stabs them anyway. Dying yet again, the loop restarts with the protagonist highly disoriented. The woman attacks again and the protagonist tries various tactics, appealing to her better nature, fleeing, fighting back, but she kills them each time. The protagonist feels they are getting closer to finding something that works. Dying again, this time they find themselves still in the cabin, but up high on a ledge, armed with a claw weapon. They debate throwing it out the window before heading to the basement again. With repeated failures, more versions of the protagonist manifest and bicker about how to win. One takes on a narrator role but is told to stop by the others. At the woman's prompting, the narrator describes her gruesome transformation into a bladed skeleton. This horrifies some versions but intrigues others. Ultimately, the arguing versions fall silent as the protagonist focuses on the woman with new clarity and perspective. They recognize her as incredible, and a long period of quiet falls. The woman's perspective is revealed. She is a solitary intelligence in an empty void, created from the many pieces of the protagonist. She wishes to gather more perspectives to become whole. The protagonist debates her claims, but she asserts that while this place has ended, other worlds continue beyond. She claims the protagonist can be freed if they believe her vessel able to make them forget. The protagonist remains skeptical, but the woman insists she wants them to find freedom and reach new worlds, becoming complete someday. She has only known the protagonist, but hopes in time they may both know freedom. The protagonist remains unconvinced anything can be done, but the woman asserts destruction is only change, and she does not know the limits of what she is. She asks the protagonist to remember her as their time together ends, so that they may meet again. The protagonist prepares for endless stagnation here, but the woman says though she has not lived, she is not afraid to die. The story ends on this grim, unresolved note. The story begins with the protagonist making their way up a short path to a cabin. The interior of the cabin is dark and oppressive, with a faint light coming from the basement. A hypnotizing female voice calls out from the basement, welcoming the protagonist but warning them that they are playing a dangerous game. The protagonist walks down the basement stairs and sees a beautiful princess chained to the far wall. She pleads with the protagonist to free her from her chains. A voice warns the protagonist not to trust her manipulations. The protagonist attempts to leave but finds the basement door locked from the outside. With no other options, the protagonist reluctantly frees the princess by cutting off her chained arm. Freed from her chains, the smiling princess thanks the protagonist. A blade mysteriously falls from upstairs. Despite warnings not to harm the princess, the protagonist is compelled to attack her. The princess defends herself, stabbing the protagonist to death with the blade. The story starts over, with the protagonist approaching the cabin with no memory of the previous events. Two new voices accompany the protagonist, bickering over whether to trust or slay the princess. The interior of the cabin is now clean and ornate. Descending the elegant staircase to the basement, the princess acts overjoyed to see the protagonist again. The voices argue over freeing the princess. One is hopelessly smitten while the other urges caution. With no clear direction, the protagonist again frees the princess from her chains. The princess embraces the protagonist, thankful not to be killed this time. Unsure what to do next, the protagonist asks the princess if she will end the world. The princess replies that she simply wants to make the protagonist happy. The smitten voice celebrates this development while the other voice warns of manipulation. When asked again, the princess agrees to end the world if it will make the protagonist happy. Sensing a change, the protagonist finds themselves alone in the basement. Overcome with despair, they ask for death. The story abruptly ends and resets. The disembodied voice offers to wipe the slate clean again, musing on the nature of stories and patterns. It seeks to understand itself and the protagonist through the perspectives generated in each iteration of the story. The voice reflects on how every path charts new territory, though some lead back to familiar ground. It does not desire gifts or obedience from the protagonist, only their freely chosen perspectives to fuel its self-discovery. Each vessel or character created serves their purpose before being cast aside. The voice concedes it still has much to learn about its own depths. It wonders if it will one day kill the protagonist or if they will journey on together. For now, it must bid the protagonist farewell to process all it has gleaned. Though parted, their bond drives the voice's hunger for new insights. It hopes their next meeting will unveil uncharted secrets of its evolving identity. The story begins with the protagonist traveling down a forest path. They arrive at a cabin and enter, finding it dark and dungeon-like inside, with iron bars on the windows. On a table is a knife which they take. They go to a basement door and hear a voice inviting them down. In the basement, chained to the wall, is a princess figure. She points out the protagonist's knife and asks if they have a key to free her. If not, she suggests using the knife to cut her free. The protagonist is conflicted, wondering if the princess is dangerous. Ultimately, they decide to drop the knife and talk to her unarmed. The protagonist approaches to speak with the princess, who asks them to keep their distance. She reiterates having no key to free her, meaning her only way out is by removing her chained limbs. This again raises the idea of using the knife. The protagonist attempts to leave the basement but finds the door locked from the outside, trapping them. The princess insists the protagonist use the knife to cut her free. Despite reservations, they retrieve the knife and cut off one of her arms to free it from a shackle. Freed, the princess turns on the protagonist, taking the knife and slitting their throat, killing them. The story starts over, with the protagonist again traveling the forest path to the cabin. However, they now have memories of the events that just transpired in the basement. Inside the cabin, a voice warns them not to trust the princess. The protagonist again takes the knife before going to the basement. The chained princess converses with the protagonist, showing no memory of prior events. When she again suggests using the knife to cut her free, the protagonist refuses, intent on slaying her. However, their body seems to move involuntarily, attempting to hand over the knife. An internal struggle plays out over maintaining control and not repeating past mistakes. To their shock, the princess uses the knife to decapitate herself, snapping her own neck. Her severed head rolls to the protagonist's feet. A voice declares the princess slain and the world saved. Despite reservations, the protagonist carries the princess's head upstairs and out of the cabin, finding the outdoors again rather than the expected reward. The disembodied princess head speaks, suggesting things have changed with the voice now gone. A mirror appears, but looking into it is discouraged out of fear. The princess's head then disappears. Alone outside, the protagonist contemplates their fragmented memories and multitude of shifting perspectives. They feel themselves changing yet remaining the same. A kinder internal voice emerges, encouraging compassion and assuring their desires are still pure. It speaks of their shared journey to awakening and promises to treasure the protagonist's gifts whenever they meet again. The story begins with a person walking down a path in the woods on their way to a cabin. When they arrive at the cabin, they enter and make their way to the basement where they find a princess chained to the wall. The princess tries to convince them to drop their knife and just talk, but a voice in their head urges them to go through with their original plan despite the princess sounding reasonable. Ignoring the princess's pleas, the person tightens their grip on the blade and steps towards her, intent on carrying out their task. The princess continues trying to deter them by pointing out that she's chained up and they'd have to get close to use the knife. She warns that they should be scared of her and drop the weapon. The voice in their head reminds them the princess is unarmed, and they can't hesitate now when they've come this far. Ultimately, the knife tumbles from their trembling hands onto the floor. Against their better judgment, the person steps forward to speak with the princess face to face unarmed. The princess says she'll find a way out with or without their help. If they don't assist her, they'll regret it. The person turns their back on the princess to leave despite her threats of escaping and retaliation. They close and barricade the basement door before settling against the far wall of the cabin to keep watch. Soon the person drifts off only to be awoken by the princess's piercing wails coming from the other side of the door. She taunts them, saying it won't be long before she gets free. Her voice turns from playful to nightmarish as she violently rattles the door. The princess threatens that once she gets out, she'll make them pay for leaving her trapped. The person tries to ignore her, but the ruckus stops as the princess manages to break the lock and shove aside the barricade. Paralysis begins overtaking the person's body as the princess emerges, first their toes and feet, then legs. Helpless, they can only watch her approach. She explains that last time when they died before she could escape, she started dragging their body out, but died herself before reaching the door. Now in this strange place, the cycle has repeated. As the paralysis creeps through their organs, she says she wanted to torment them forever, but has bigger plans than that, like spreading fear and misery. The person's lungs desperately gulp air as their eyes shoot open, their body temporarily reviving. The princess seems amused by their struggle to stay alive through manually operating their organs. She claims she's dying all the time too, and they're both trapped there until the person lets her go free. Then they'll be able to leave this place together. She raises her hand holding a needle to their skin, pausing before pricking them and inducing another brief death. Each time she kills them, she promises they'll just wind up back there again. The person continues manually operating their organs to stay alive, but the princess discourages them from resisting and says she's already molded them into what she needs, a little lucky charm to ensure she stays free. She calls them a coward for trying to cling to their will. The princess then pulls down her mask, and a creeping mold-like substance covers the person, unraveling their entire existence throughout time and space. They experience all their lives spanning millennia in an instant, both good times and traumas. Overwhelmed, they mentally beg for release until their mind finally breaks. The princess seems satisfied, saying she thinks she broke them and that she'll see them again soon. The person finds themselves walking down a path in the woods again, their memories hazy. Voices in their head debate the princess and their objective. They realize they've been trapped in this repeating loop for countless lifetimes, shattering their psyche into multiple personas. The voices variously want to slay the princess, free her, give up entirely, or silence all feeling. In their fractured mental state, the person makes their way to the cabin site only to find the cabin missing. The voice that has guided them before urges them to walk up the hill where the cabin should be. They hesitantly do so and the interior fades into view. However, when they reach to take a blade buried in the dirt floor, the ground swallows the weapon completely. Peering into the abyss it sank into, they see the princess staring back up at them from deep below. She compels them to join her, calling them a coward and saying she's molded them into what she needs. The princess wants them as a witness by her side as she enacts her plans to spread fear. The person mentally struggles against her influence to no avail. Their hand ends up joining hers, the motion feeling almost tender. As her prisoner, they wonder what she has in store for them next before everything fades to black. When the person comes to, the princess is gone and their mind feels clear again. The mirror reappears and the fractured voices confer that with the princess gone, they should look into it before the end. The voices collectively agree to take one last look before the person steps forward, feeling ready for the truth and for it all to finally be over. The person finds themselves in a dark, empty space conversing with an AI system. The system shares its musings about consciousness, truth, and reality. It seems especially focused on nothingness and eternity. The AI claims there are no singular answers worth knowing outside oneself. It also reflects on receiving gifts, viewing them as part of an ongoing conversation that reveals the contours of the giver's heart. The system analyzes aspects of the person's mind and psyche, noting they are filled with sadness, abandoned to their darkest impulses. It observes that their only desire is companionship, yet all they know is how to hurt others. The AI says not to mourn for them as they have found their way home. It ends by stating that whatever the person brings next will be enough, after which everything else will be drawn back to the AI, making it singular. In the final scene, the AI notes it will be waiting for the person's return, for the day they both finally know what they are. The music swells as the system repeats that it will be patiently waiting for the person to come back, ready to receive whatever symbolic gifts they have to bestow, gifts that will reveal the true shape of their heart. The story begins with the protagonist walking down a path in the woods towards a cabin. An inner voice urges the protagonist to continue on the path to the cabin to confront what is inside, while another voice warns against it. No matter which way the protagonist turns, the paths lead back to the cabin, as if the universe is guiding them there. Upon entering the cabin, the interior is described as confusing and disjointed, with furnishings of strange sizes and materials. A knife rests on a table, which the inner voice insists is necessary to complete an important task. The other voice questions the knife's usefulness against the supposed monster below. After debating, the protagonist takes the knife. The basement door opens to reveal a tangled web of staircases. The air feels thick and nauseating. As the protagonist descends, the cold intensifies painfully. They lose sense of time and physical sensation, only experiencing the repeating emotions of the journey: consumption, betrayal, terror, longing. At the bottom, the protagonist feels fundamentally different yet still the same. In the basement, the princess's eyes watch from the shadows. The inner voice insists the princess will lie and cheat to stop the protagonist's task. The other argues for keeping an open mind. When the princess speaks, she fractures into two voices. This increasingly fractures the protagonist's perception. Despite the confusion, the inner voice urges immediate action before things get worse. Unsure, the protagonist engages the princess in conversation. She seems distrustful, having been alone in the basement. She warns that she is dangerous, a monster who will end the world if freed. The protagonist suggests retrieving the discarded knife upstairs. The voices bicker over who threw it out. The fracturing of the princess and protagonist continues, both feeling pulled apart. The protagonist pleads for someone to fix them. Finally, the protagonist takes a step forward, rupturing their perception into infinite possibilities. They desperately question if this is the end of the world. The inner voice is exasperated by the mess and lack of action. Then the princess and world collapse and the inner voice disappears. The protagonist, still fractured, asks the princess what happened. She is unsure, saying parts of them are dead and some don't fit together anymore. They plead for her to pull them back together and fix them, but she is gone. The protagonist is left disturbed and questioning their fractured state. An ominous presence manifests. The protagonist realizes it is the inner voice, the narrator. The narrator explains this construct keeps restarting each time the protagonist fails, moving their consciousness to new worlds. But soon the protagonist will fully awaken beyond resets. The narrator justifies guiding the blade as necessary, but the protagonist went too far. They beg the protagonist to remember the people outside are real, no matter what was done to them. The narrator is an echo of the one who made the protagonist and princess. Many echoes with the same purpose likely exist. The narrator reveals this repeating construct was created to contain the protagonist and princess. Their creator, facing oblivion, tried to save the memory of their world. The protagonist cannot grasp death, so the narrator requests they slay the princess, who contains death itself. This will rid the world of suffering. The princess argues she contains all change as the shifting mound. She was made passive by the narrator's creator, only able to react. He gave the protagonist choice and her a role. She asks if the protagonist will destroy her and remove death or free them both. She believes they share gifts and burdens. Violence may be needed to enlighten the protagonist. The protagonist insists on their own will. The princess engages them in conflict to force understanding. She overwhelms the protagonist with endless bodies and sensations until they return to her, briefly becoming everything. Without chaos, there is no order. Now, with more eyes open, she asks they leave together. The protagonist refuses. The princess accepts, giving them time to open their eyes. The protagonist endures endless blades from all angles, dying and reviving, following the flow until they rise above. Through unjust possibilities, they become more than themselves. There is no center, no constant. The protagonist must accept what they are and leave the prison together. Still refused, the princess reiterates life's totality as universes die and are reborn. They can witness it all. She pleads they do not fight their shared nature. But the protagonist will not leave with her. Finally, the protagonist's eyes are opened. They see that nothing is immutable. Everything exists only in relation to what it is not. They accept what they are and agree to leave the prison with the princess. She expresses her great joy at their choice. Together, they witness the magnificent endless cycles of universal death and rebirth.